Now, when the government spends, it credits a bank account and credits the reserves of that bank. That is a government debt. Okay? Currency is a government debt. Okay. So all of these credits the government is making, whether it's an electronic entry or issuing a tally stick to you, the government is in debt. All money things are debts of their issuers. Okay. The difference is that these are non-interest paying debts. So currency is government debt, but we don't normally include it in our figure of 15 trillion or whatever the outstanding bonds are, because they don't pay interest. Similarly, bank reserves are a government debt, a debt of the central bank. Okay. Again, in the old days, they didn't pay any interest. They're not included as part of the measured government debt, the figures that you always read about. So again, this might seem like a little quibble, but I just want to make clear. All of those credits that the government is giving are debt, in the same way that bonds are debt. It's just that we don't promise to pay interest on them. So why does the government issue some bonds that banks use reserves to buy, or that households can use their deposits to buy? The bonds promise to pay interest. Why does the government do that? What I was explaining is the government does that to hit its overnight interest rate target. It is not a borrowing operation. In fact, the government cannot sell those bonds unless you already have government debt to buy them. You have to have currency, or you have to have bank reserves, or your bank has to have bank reserves to buy them. Because the only thing the government will accept in payment for the bonds that it issues is its own debt, its own IOUs. So bond sales actually don't change the amount of government debt out there. They change the form from non-interest paying to interest paying. Now, does a sovereign government need to do this? No. They never need to do this. If they're happy with a zero interest rate, they can just leave the reserves in the banking system, and you will have a zero overnight interest rate. So I realize people are very concerned about government paying interest on its debt. And as you said, it becomes a rising share of total government spending. But look at it this way. In the first place, the government doesn't have to sell any bonds. It can just leave reserves in the banking system. Okay? On which the banks get zero in the old days. Now it's near zero interest. They get 25 basis points. Okay, so it doesn't have to sell them in the first place. Second place, the government can choose the interest rate that it pays. It's the sovereign issuer of the currency. It can sell the bonds to achieve the interest rate target that its central bank arm has set. Okay? 50 basis points now. The government chooses that interest rate. And the third point is, the government can always afford to make the interest payments. Why? Because the government makes interest payments in the same way that it does any kind of spending, by crediting a bank account. All right? And as the St. Louis Fed said, it can never run out of dollars. So if the government chose, let's pay 10% on our government bonds, and let's run the debt up to $15 trillion, is there any conceivable way that the government won't be able to pay the interest on that? The answer is no. There's no conceivable way. They can always afford it, because they make the interest payments by crediting bank accounts. Okay? Now, I'm not saying that we should have 10% interest rates. Okay? I'm not necessarily saying that we ought to sell government bonds at all. But it's a policy choice. Why does the government do it? Because your pension funds like to have government bonds in their portfolios, and they like to earn interest. Maybe it's a good public policy to sell bonds, stuff the private pension funds full of them, and pay them interest. But it's a policy choice. It's not forced by markets. It's not forced by any natural laws. We choose to do it. Okay, sorry, now I remember I'm supposed to keep answers short.
Do you want to come back?
Very briefly, I can't say I really fully understood the details, but just as a follow-up, if it takes place as you say they do, is there a transfer of wealth taking place? Is that what's going on in the country now, a transfer of wealth through this mechanism?
Yeah. Okay. This would be one of the considerations you want to make when you decide whether it's a good idea to pay interest on government debt. You want to look at who holds the government debt. Okay? If it was elderly Social Security recipients with insufficient private saving, you might say it's a good policy. On the other hand, if you find that financial wealth is extremely concentrated in the hands of the top 1%, you might say this is not a good policy. We need to find an alternative way to make sure that our seniors have a decent income. Because paying interest on government bonds is flowing to the top. I think this is a good question for Michael.
Okay. Up at the back, yeah.
As I understand it, the government is selling bonds to affect the Fed funds rate and control interest rates in the domestic economy. Then why does it have an interest in selling bonds to foreign investors?
Okay. It's selling bonds to hit its target rate. Okay? And I know, again, there's a lot of concern that foreigners hold a lot of the government bonds, especially right now it's Chinese. Okay? And before that it was Japanese. How do they get them? They get dollar credits to bank accounts and to their central bank's account at the Fed when they sell us stuff and we buy it with dollars. So they have accounts that are full of dollars at the central bank. Okay, so there are reserves there. And when we sell bonds, they have the option of using those reserves to buy bonds. So again, it's just a substitution from a non-interest bearing account at the Fed to an interest bearing account at the Fed. It's like going from your checking account to your savings account. They transfer the funds, and actually it is the Fed that transfers the funds. The Fed keeps the books for our government. Again, if we don't like paying interest to foreigners, have a zero interest rate target. Okay?
I guess my question is, what's the government's interest in offering the interest-bearing versus the non-interest bearing account? Does that make sense?
Well, again, I don't think that there is a very good reason for doing this. I think that it's sort of, well, we've always done it. The governments have always sold bonds, and they've always kept their overnight interest rate above zero. Personally, I think the system would operate better without any interest-paying debt and with an overnight interest rate target of zero permanently. I wouldn't use the interest rate in the way that most central banks use it to try to fine-tune the economy. I think it's been a disastrous failure, and it has led to lots of misunderstanding and payment of interest to foreigners.